Can the Democrats take back the Senate in 2020, or will Republicans hold on to the upper chamber of the United States Congress? In this video, I'll highlight some of the most critical Senate races for the 2020 election. I'll lay out which seats are likely to go to Democrats, which are likely to go to Republicans, and work to resolve this question about the Senate elections. Who will win? Currently, the GOP controls the US Senate with 53 seats out of 100. Democrats have a de facto grip on the remaining 47, although technically there are just 45 Democratic senators. This is because the two independent senators, Bernie Sanders and Angus King, caucus with the Democrats. To seize control of the Senate, Democrats would need to gain an additional 4 seats in the Senate, or 3 plus the presidency, as the vice president works as the tiebreaker in the Senate. For Republicans to retain control of the Senate, they can lose a maximum of 2 seats, or 3 if Donald Trump is re-elected, which would keep his vice president, presumably Mike Pence, as the tie-breaking vote. In the 2020 election, 35 Senate seats are up for grabs. Of those, 12 are currently held by Democrats, while 23 are held by Republicans. Because Republicans have significantly more seats up for election, they are at least theoretically more vulnerable to change. But to fully understand the potential vulnerability of the GOP when it comes to the Senate, we need to look at polling to determine which seats are likely to hold and which are likely to flip. Here's a chart of every Senate seat up for election in 2020. Generally speaking, the solid blue and solid red seats are considered relatively safer, but that's not to say those races aren't worth paying attention to at all. If you were looking to run an insurgency primary challenge from the right of the Republicans or from the left of Democrats, these safe seats are exactly what you'd want to go after. Democratic Socialists, for example, would do best to go after solidly blue seats, in particular seats with high numbers according to the Cook Partisan Voting Index, like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Illinois, or New Jersey, if and only if the incumbent is perceived to be unpopular, weak, or out of touch with their constituents. But even if successful primary challenges happen in states like these, this isn't likely to impact the general election outcome. So for our purposes, we can move on. There are, however, some relatively safe seats that are worth some additional attention. One Senate race worth watching is the re-election bid of Democrat Doug Jones of Alabama. This seat is considered relatively safe only insofar it is a safe bet that Republicans will flip it. Alabama is, after all, generally considered to be a Republican stronghold. So you might be wondering, why is there a Democratic senator in Alabama in the first place? Well, Doug Jones won the seat in a 2017 special election against Republican Roy Moore. At the time, if you don't recall, Roy Moore became embroiled in a number of scandals that made national headlines. He was accused of sexually assaulting 3 women, 2 of them minors at the time of the alleged incidents. 6 other women recalled him pursuing romantic relationships with them, while they were between the ages of 16 and 22. He was also unofficially banned from the mall for allegedly harassing teenage girls. In the face of this, it's actually surprising that Doug Jones did as poorly as he did in that election, just barely squeaking into power with 50.0% of the vote. Roy Moore managed to secure the endorsement of President Trump and 48.3% of the vote. Roy Moore actually ran again for that Senate seat in the 2020 Republican primary. He secured just 7% of the vote. The winner will be determined in a runoff set to take place on July 14th. The candidate who received the largest share of the vote was Tommy Tuberville, who prior to this election was mainly known for his successful career as a college football coach. But expected to win in that runoff is Jeff Sessions, who served as a U.S. Senator from Alabama between 1997 and 2017, before resigning that post to serve as Attorney General in the Trump administration until 2018, when he was essentially fired by tweet. Should he win the primary, it will be interesting to see whether Sessions receives Trump's endorsement, having been lambasted in the past by the president on Twitter. But as far as the race itself goes, his experience and name recognition alone should make taking Jones down a bit of a cakewalk, with or without the support of the Trump wing of the Republican Party. Another interesting but relatively safe seat is that of Jeanne Shaheen. While polling indicates her re-election is likely, Shaheen has also been identified as a possible VP pick for Joe Biden. Back in November of 2019, Joe listed the 2 senators in New Hampshire as potential running mates. And more recently, in his last debate with Bernie Sanders, he made it clear that his running mate would be, in fact, a woman. On top of that, Shaheen is viewed as politically similar to Biden, less progressive and more bipartisan than the Sanders wing of the Democratic coalition. If Biden did select her as his running mate, Republicans would have a very good shot at making a play for her seat. That's because while Shaheen is seen as likely to secure re-election, the PVI lists her seat as a toss-up. The potential vulnerability of this Senate seat is actually a good reason to suspect that Biden will look elsewhere for a running mate. Democratic insiders have also listed a number of reasons to discount her. She's not particularly young, she's viewed as a political insider, she's not a person of color, and her state does not carry a lot of electoral college votes. So Shaheen's seat looks safe for the time being, but if Biden does end up selecting her as his running mate, that is sure to change. Now, returning to our map of the Senate seats up for election in 2020, let's begin to fill in who these seats are likely to go to, using RCP's polling data. 10 seats are considered safe for Republicans: Dan Sullivan's seat in Alaska, Tom Cotton's Arkansas seat, Jim Rish's seat in Idaho, Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, Jim Inhofe, Oklahoma, Lindsey Graham, South Carolina, Mike Round, South Dakota, Shelley Moore Capito, West Virginia, and Wyoming's seat currently held by Mike Enzi, who is retiring. The Republican primary will likely determine who replaces Mike Enzi in Wyoming. Polling favors Liz Cheney, the current U.S. representative for Wyoming's at-large congressional district and daughter of former VP Dick Cheney. But she's declined to run for Senate, instead opting to run for re-election in the House. The next highest polling contender is Cynthia Lummis, a former treasurer of Wyoming and congresswoman from the state. She has declared her candidacy. Other declared candidates include a geologist, Mark Armstrong, businessman Robert Short, and Wyoming Army National Guard veteran Joshua Wheeler. But yeah, it's probably going to go to Cynthia Lummis. According to RCP, there are 4 safe seats for Democrats: Chris Coons from Delaware, Dick Durbin from Illinois, Ed Markey from Massachusetts, and Jack Reed from Rhode Island. There are 5 likely Republican seats, again according to RCP. These include the Alabama seat currently held by Doug Jones and likely to soon be held by Jeff Sessions, David Perdue's seat in Georgia, Mitch McConnell's seat in Kentucky, Cindy Hyde-Smith in Mississippi, and the Tennessee seat currently held by Lamar Alexander, who is retiring. Declared Republican candidates for this seat include dentist Byron Bush, retired physician's assistant Johnny Presley, truck driver Aaron Pettigrew, music industry executive Stokes Nielsen, someone named Roy Dale Cope, orthopedic surgeon Manny Sethi, and former U.S. ambassador to Japan Bill Hagerty, who has also served as a businessman and commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development. There are 3 likely Democratic seats, according to RCP, which will go to Cory Booker of New Jersey, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, and Mark Warner of Virginia. Now, if you look at how this all maps out right now, just filling in the safe and likely seats, you can see that the apparent advantage Democrats had is already dissolving. With 15 seats on the board as either safe or likely, the GOP need another 5 to 6 seats to secure a majority. While with just 7 seats as either safe or likely, Democrats need to secure another 8 to 9 seats to win back the Senate. According to RCP, 3 of those seats lean Democratic. Jean Shaheen's seat in New Hampshire, assuming she doesn't get veeped, Tina Smith's seat in Minnesota, and Tom Udall's seat in New Mexico. Now, Udall is actually the only incumbent Democratic senator who is not running for re-election in 2020. He is retiring. While 3 other Democratic primary contenders have since withdrawn, the only remaining declared candidate for the Dems is Ben Ray Lujan, who has served as the U.S. representative for New Mexico's 3rd congressional district since 2009. Running on the Republican side are Gavin Clarkson, a former professor at New Mexico State University, Elisa Martinez, executive director of the New Mexico Alliance for Life, and leading in the polling amongst the Republicans is former local news meteorologist Mark Ronchetti. And because he's a former meteorologist, it was not hard to find this picture of him standing in front of a green screen. That means we can put literally anything we want behind him, which is pretty fun.
These nuts. Miss Benji.
Drake is better than Tupac and Biggie.
There are 4 seats that lean Republican according to RCP. John Cornyn's seat in Texas, Joni Ernst's seat in Iowa, Kelly Loeffler's seat in Georgia, and Pat Roberts' seat in Kansas. Now, Loeffler was appointed her seat by Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, following the resignation of Johnny Isakson in 2019. So she did not have to win an election to gain her seat in the first place, and her 2020 race is a special election. Prior to her appointment, she was the CEO of Bakkt, a subsidiary of Intercontinental Exchange, a financial exchanges company. She's also a co-owner of the Atlanta Dream, a team in the WNBA. Now, Loeffler is a particularly vulnerable incumbent because of the 2020 congressional insider trading scandal. After attending a closed meeting in which senators were briefed about the dangers of coronavirus, Loeffler and her husband, Jeffrey Sprecher, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, dumped millions of dollars of stock and bought new stock in a company called Citrix Systems, which saw an increase in value following the stock market crash caused by COVID. To add insult to injury, she also tweeted at the time about how Democrats were overhyping the risks of the pandemic. Loeffler is facing a number of primary challengers. U.S. Navy veteran Derek Grayson, businesswoman Annette Davis Jackson, Student Services Coordinator for Appling County Board of Education Candace Taylor, former COO of the Office of Federal Student Aid Wayne Johnson, and most significantly, Doug Collins, a 4-term U.S. representative for Georgia's 9th Congressional District. There are also a number of potential Democratic challengers, including Joe Lieberman's son, Matt Lieberman, and former state senator and U.S. Attorney Ed Tarver. Also, Reverend Raphael Warnock, and philosophy professor Richard Winfield. Also of note, the notorious Vermin Supreme is running for the Libertarian ticket. In the head-to-head polling so far, the Republicans appear to be likely to hold on to the seat. But Loeffler's primary opponent, Doug Collins, seems to be substantially more electable than she is. Pat Roberts of Kansas is retiring, and a number of Republican candidates have thrown their hats in the ring to replace him. So far, the top polling candidate is Chris Kobach, Secretary of State of Kansas and former chair of the Kansas Republican Party, who came to national prominence over his hardline anti-immigration views and calls for stronger voter ID laws, anti-abortion legislation, and a national registry of Muslims in the United States. The highest profile Democratic candidate is Kansas State Senator Barbara Bollier. While the seat likely leans Republican, some early head-to-head polling seems to indicate that she might have a chance of beating Kobach. So all in all, counting seats that are safe, likely, or lean, Republicans can be expected to take 19 seats and Democrats 10. This leaves 6 seats as toss-ups, and as you can see, the odds do not look good for Democrats. Assuming that all the safe, likely, and lean seats go to the most likely party, Democrats would have to win all 6 of the toss-ups to secure the majority, or 5 plus the presidency. To hold on to the Senate, Republicans would have to win just one of the toss-ups or win the presidential election. For Democrats, among the safer toss-up seats is Gary Peters' seat in Michigan. Aside from Doug Jones of Alabama, Peters is the only Democratic senator facing re-election in a state that Trump won in 2016. While there is a primary scheduled for August 4th, so far Peters is running unopposed for the Democratic nomination, and the only Republican candidates are perennial candidate Bob Carr and John James, who is a businessman and Iraq War veteran. Head-to-head polling seems to lean fairly consistently in Peters' direction. Then there's Cory Gardner's Senate seat for Colorado. Gardner won the seat in a close race against Democrat Mark Udall back in 2014, and he's unlikely to face a serious primary challenge. But 2 serious Democratic challengers are coming for him. First, there's Andrew Romanoff, former Speaker of the Colorado House of Representatives. He's the clear favorite of progressives, endorsed by Our Revolution, the Sunrise Movement, and Progressive Democrats of America. He ran a failed primary challenge to Michael Bennet in 2010. Now he'll be facing off against another failed contender for the 2020 presidential primary, John Hickenlooper. Hickenlooper has been endorsed by everyone from Joe Biden to Michael Bennet to Andrew Yang, and polling indicates he is likely to secure the Democratic nomination for this race. In the head-to-head polling against Cory Gardner, Hickenlooper has so far appeared to consistently come out the winner. Then there's the special election in Arizona for the seat currently occupied by Martha McSally. McSally earned her seat after losing Arizona's 2018 U.S. Senate election against Democratic Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema. Following that election, Jon Kyl announced his resignation from the state's other Senate seat, and Governor Doug Ducey appointed McSally to succeed Kyl. McSally now faces some minor primary challengers against a former teacher, Ann Griffin, and a skincare company executive, Daniel McCarthy, but so far she's the only Republican to pick up any major endorsements. Her potential Democratic challengers include Mohammed Arif, a businessman and perennial candidate, and Mark Kelly, who is very likely to win the Democratic primary. Kelly is an engineer and retired astronaut, former U.S. Navy captain, and the husband of former U.S. Representative Gabby Giffords. The head-to-head polling currently leans fairly strongly in Kelly's direction. If you're keeping track, we've now seen 3 toss-ups all appear to lean in the Democratic direction, putting them one seat behind the Republicans. Next, let's look at Maine's Senate seat, currently occupied by Susan Collins. While Collins has been elected to the seat 4 times, each term by greater margins than the last, this year is expected to be different. She is so far running unopposed in the Republican primary, but is seen as potentially vulnerable in the general. This is essentially because Collins built her brand on being the quintessential moderate Republican, but has received criticism for not breaking with Republicans on recent significant and controversial decisions. She voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court and to acquit President Trump on both impeachment charges brought by the House, initially stating as her reasoning that she believed Trump had learned his lesson from being impeached. 3 Democrats are contending for a chance to run against Collins. The progressive favorite is Betsy Sweet, endorsed by groups like Justice Democrats, Our Revolution, and local Bernie-crats of Maine. But the more likely contender is probably Sarah Gideon, who swept the one low sample size poll I could find. Head-to-head polling between Gideon and Collins actually shows Gideon as having the momentum. She's lost more polls overall, but won the 2 most recent ones, albeit by rather thin margins. The next and penultimate toss-up race is for North Carolina's Senate seat currently held by Thom Tillis. Tillis won the Republican primary race with 78% of the vote, and will be facing off against Cal Cunningham, who won the Democratic primary with 57% of that vote. The head-to-head polling between the two so far has been pretty neck and neck, but in the last 4 polls, Cunningham has had the lead. The polling advantage is also mirrored by fundraising figures. While Tillis had enjoyed a strong fundraising advantage early on in the race, in the first quarter of 2020, Cunningham pulled in more than double the haul of Tillis, $4.4 million compared to $2.1 million received by Tillis in the same period. The race is clearly still too close to call, but if I had to bet, I'd put my money on Cunningham to overtake Tillis. The final race is for Republican Steve Daines' seat for Montana. To run as the Republican nominee, Steve Daines still has to win his primary challenges. He's taking on John Driscoll, who was the Democratic Speaker of the Montana House of Representatives during the late 1970s, and Daniel Larson, a hardware store manager who supports UBI. I like the Yang angle, but needless to say, I expect Daines to win. His Democratic challenger will be either John Muse, a nuclear engineer and U.S. Navy veteran, or far more likely former 2020 presidential nominee and incumbent Montana Governor Steve Bullock. While Bullock was not a serious presidential contender, that run helped to bolster the candidate's name recognition, and he was already the most popular statewide official in Montana. While the state is a deeply red one, head-to-head polling does seem to favor Bullock over Daines so far. So if you're keeping track, the most recent polling seems to give Democrats the edge in all 6 toss-up elections, meaning if all the polling holds, Democrats would take back control of the Senate with a coalition of 51 seats to 49 for Republicans. That will have to serve as my prediction for the time being, but there are numerous factors to keep in mind. First, let's keep in mind that all polling is just an indicator, and many of the polls done for Senate races have fairly low sample sizes and wide margins of error. A number of races could end up varying substantially from what the polls currently indicate. Adding to the unreliability of current polling is the fact that there is a long way out between now and November. Politicians have been known to drop the ball in election years, whether they gaffe, are hit by a scandal, or are confronted by an unexpected election challenger. Incumbents can be damaged by a downturn in the economy or a bad vote. Challengers can be damaged when journalists and constituents look into their records and find unpleasant surprises. Let's also keep in mind the coattail effect, the fact that elections for major positions can have an effect on down-ballot races. While U.S. Senator is not exactly a small job, the presidential election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump can have a significant influence on the turnout and opinions of voters. With races this close, a faceplant by either party leader could seriously damage their party's chances of winning the Senate. And if the Democrats win just one fewer seat than I've projected here, the balance in the Senate will not be determined by any Senate race at all, but by the presidential election, which will indirectly cast either Joe Biden's VP or Mike Pence as the body's tiebreaker. So control of the Senate may actually come down to Joe Biden and Donald Trump and this question.